In this session, we're going to cover Pyramid Xtender, which is the cross-tenant data exchanger engine for switching out data sources for users based on their tenancy. It is, in effect, an easy-to-manage solution for single-tenant data sources in a multi-tenant deployment. In a typical multi-tenant deployment of Pyramid, data is typically secured for different tenants using row-level security. So, users in tenants 1 to 3 log in and use the same reports, shown in green, with the same semantic model, shown in orange, pointed at one singular data source. Each user sees the right data through the enactment of row-level security mechanics, either built into Pyramid or built into the data source itself. This is the modern approach to handling multi-tenant access on a multi-tenant data source. However, there are many scenarios where this is not possible. Instead, we sometimes find that each tenant has their own independent data source. So, tenant 1 is looking at report pack 1, with model number 1 looking at database number 1, and so on. This approach is effective, albeit a little hard to administer and manage. Often, in Pyramid, developers create a standardized set of reports and models that are then copied out to each tenant and rewired for each tenant's data source, either manually or via API. And this is where the new Xtender engine kicks in. The first type of Xtender, known as the database Xtender, switches out the database by tenant. This method allows admins to give all tenants the same common content, pointed at the same common semantic model, using the same data server instance, except there is a need to change the underlying database for each user based on their tenancy. Effectively, it makes the database the inflection point for security, albeit without further granular security control. The second type of Xtender, known as the data source Xtender, switches out the data source or data server instance by tenant. This method allows admins to give all tenants the same common content, pointed at the same semantic model, using different data server instances for each user based on their tenancy, while still using a common database name and structure. You can, of course, mix and match both Xtender types, together with row-level security, to handle many kinds of scenarios. To see Xtender in action, we'll first walk through a variety of setup points necessary for the Xtender engine to operate. First, we need to ensure that Pyramid is licensed for the Xtender and multi-tenancy capabilities. We need both for Xtender to work. Under Content, in the admin, multi-tenancy must be enabled with cross-tenancy for content and for user roles. Next, under Data Sources, we have a primary data source set up for this demo called Xmaster. It is an Xtender data source as denoted by this icon. In the Xtender dropdown, we see options for the data server Xtender, the database Xtender, and an option to use both. Now, let's check our primary data model, Xtender sales model, sitting under the Xmaster data source and under the primary database Xtender sample all. This is the central model against which our centralized content will operate. We can see our sample report XT content in the Content Manager, which is pointed at our primary data source. Further, we can see the cross-tenant XReader role has been applied for different users from different tenants against both the content and the folder. Returning to the admin, we can also see the various tenants setup. We have the default tenant together with some other tenants, Xacme, Xnuke, and so on and so forth. Some are for different manufacturers based on our sales database, who are all tenants, while there's a different tenant, Xred, focused on all Red products, and then there is of course Xtexas, which will only see data for the state of Texas. Now, let's see how we have configured Xtender in our primary data source. We can see for some of our tenants that we've already mapped Xtender to point at a different data server. In this case, the Xacme tenant will look at the X sub-Acme data server, as will the Xnuke tenant. Tenant XAllBalance would instead point at a different data server. Some of the tenants don't have a mapping, which just means that they will use the primary data server Xmaster. This is then the first way of splitting up access to data, through the data sources or data server connection. If we jump to the databases for Xmaster in the Data Source Manager, we'll see an extra tab for Xtender databases. Here we can see a second mapping of tenants to database names. In the setup, tenant xnuke will be using a database called Xtender sample nuke, while tenant xtexas will be looking at a database called Xtender sample texas. Since we are using both data service switching and database switching, the resulting effect is that one or two settings will be switched for each user depending on which tenant they belong to. In this section of the demo, we will see all of this come into action. But before we continue, let's take a quick look at our test users. mtest1 is part of the xacme tenant, mtest2 is part of xnuke, mtest3 is part of the xred tenant, and finally mtest4 is part of xtexas. Switching back and looking at our primary report on the left side of the screen, we can see all manufacturers by every product color for every state, with 3 different metrics against our primary data source. Now, using the mtest1 user in a browser session on the right, we'll open up the exact same Discover report, which is still pointed at the primary data source, and yet they can only see the Acme data, since that's the only data in the alternative data source underlying this query that we are querying behind the scenes. If I now switch to mtest2 and open up the same report again, we'll only see nuke data. Again, a different data source behind the scenes is driving the query results as we see on screen here. mtest3 only sees red data. Again, this is the only data available in their data source shown when this report is opened. And finally, mtest4 can see all the manufacturers for all product colors. But when we use the swap function and look at just states, we can see that it is filled with only Texas data because in her data source, it is a dataset with only Texas-based information. This is a good demonstration of how the Xtender engine switches data sources for users based on tenancy and delivers a point-and-click, easy-to-manage solution for single-tenant data sources in a multi-tenant deployment.